Hi, I'm Jeremy Jansen, and this is the January 2011 issue of Reason Wizardry. For this first issue of the new year, I've done something a little bit different. This month, we're going to be looking at some performance figures for the different Reason devices and how they compare as to putting a load on your host computer. So, by using this knowledge, we can more intelligently design combinators that will run with better performance on our own and others' computers. And in addition to that, after I've detailed some of the information I've found out about performance, we're going to continue on and look at a very underrated device in the Reason rack and how to make the most out of it. Alright, so for this performance test, first I'm going to describe how it was done. I'm not going to be doing it live because I wouldn't get an accurate test since I'm also capturing video at the same time. My computer might even crash. Probably not due to Reason, but it's just not a great time to be attempting something that maxes out your CPU when you're recording something like this. So I will tell you my results and how it was done, and we'll start with the ladder. Basically what I've done is created a sequencer track with 32 notes in it. And they're all playing for 3 bars. And they're all being routed to one combinator, and inside this combinator there is 14 subtractors. So 14 subtractors, they're all identical, and they all have 32 polyphony. So let's get out a calculator here. So 32 voices times 14. So for this combinator to play back, if it does play back correctly, you're going to be playing actually 448 synth voices. Now, it's a pretty basic patch. Essentially, it's just 2 oscillators being played back in Subtractor. No fancy modulation or anything like that to confuse the issue. So when I ran this test on my computer, I found that not only did I have no problem running one of these combinators, but I could actually run many of these combinators. And the final figure I came up with as far as how many voices were running simultaneously was 3,296 Subtractor voices. Now, I should mention a few things about that. What I based the maximum number on is not when I started to hear crackles. I heard crackles perhaps before that, but that's kind of subjective. When there might be a very slight crackle, where's the exact cutoff? So instead, my cutoff was using the CPU usage limit in Reason. I set that to 95, and when you go over 95% CPU, Reason will stop the playback and warn you that you can't play the song back. So I use that warning signal as my maximum number of voices. So if I got that warning signal, then I would slowly start removing subtractors until I was able to play back the 3 bars of MIDI without getting any CPU warning signal. So once again, 3,296 subtractor voices. That is incredible. I don't have a supercomputer by any means. I'm going to include a text file with this issue of Wizardry with a little bit more information about my setup. And for all these different device tests, I've included the RNS files so you can run them on your own computer. and see what kind of results you get, or maybe run them on a computer you're thinking of upgrading to, and so you'll know how much more performance you'll get in Reason. So once I achieved this result for Subtractor, I thought it would be pretty interesting to run this type of test on all Reason's devices and kind of get a better overview of what kind of CPU costs are associated with some of the older devices and some of the newer ones like Thor and Kong, etc. So I've done a test for every one of Reason's synths and samplers, and I've got all that information in the text file, and I'm going to also discuss it a little bit as well. So the next test that I ran was for Thor, because I was really curious if I created a very similar setup in Thor to Subtractor, and here it is, 2 analog oscillators running through one single low-pass filter. How would that compare in terms of CPU usage? Obviously, if we add a whole bunch of filters and some mod matrix craziness, 3 oscillators and a whack-load of modulation, maybe shaping, that's obviously going to be much more heavy on your CPU than a simple subtractor. But a very basic patch like this is what I was curious how that would measure up against the subtractor patch. So I created a test RNS file, pretty much exactly the same, except for using Thors instead of subtractors. And I ran the same test, and I found I maxed out at 384 voices. Now, that's still a lot of voices. Just consider there's still many digital DSP-driven virtual analog hardware synths on the market that have maybe 16 or less voices. We're talking about 384 for an amazing semi-modular synth like Thor. But amazingly, the subtractor can produce over 8 times the amount of voices with a similar patch as Thor can. And you might say, well, who cares? Thor sounds so much better, and we have such powerful CPUs nowadays that still doesn't mean that there's really any valid reason to use Subtractor. And I disagree with that, and I'm going to talk about exactly why at the end of this issue of Wizardry when we look a little bit in depth into Subtractor and why I think it still has some relevance even in Reason 5. But right now, I'm going to continue on and show you more results and a little bit of discussion about them from the other devices that I tested in Reason. So here you can see the Maelstrom test RNS file that I set up to figure out how many voices I could squeeze out of Maelstrom. It's a little bit different because Maelstrom doesn't go up to 32 voices of polyphony. It only goes up to 16. So you need to keep that in mind when you're multiplying how many devices that you are able to add and how many combinators you are able to add. So in my case, I came up with 848 Maelstrom voices. So more than double the voices in Thor, but still considerably less than the 3,000 plus subtractor voices. As you can see here, I tried to set up a relatively similar patch to the subtractor with 2 oscillators running through one single filter. The next device that I tested is also one that goes all the way back to the very early versions of Reason, and it's the NN19 sampler. Now, I got an amazing amount of voices out of this sampler. I really didn't expect to come close to this number. I got 2,816 sampler voices. So just over 400 voices less than the subtractor. For this test, I loaded a fairly small 2 megabyte acoustic guitar sample set. I set up the NN19 with 32 notes of polyphony, and I turned on the filter. High quality interpolation is also turned on. So after I got this result, I was fairly curious how the NNXT would turn out, since it's quite a bit newer. And while I don't think there's much in terms of sound quality that's different between the two, the NNXT has many more features for putting together complex sample sets. So how much does that actually wear on your CPU? For the NNXT test, I tested the exact same sample set as the NN19 had loaded, which is the acoustic guitar from the factory library. I set up NNXT with 32 notes of polyphony and turned the filter on, and that's basically it. And what I found was I got 2048 voices with the NNXT, which, if you do a bit of calculation, adds up to about 30% more CPU usage than the NN19. So for me, that lets me know that if I have a relatively simple sample set that doesn't need, say, the multiple velocity layers, etc., that's possible in the NNXT, I'm better off loading that in the NN19, especially if you don't need to use a filter, because perhaps the NNXT filter sounds a little bit better, but if you just want to purely play back a sample set with one single layer, there's no reason at all to do it in the NNXT. You can use the NN19, save some CPU usage, and also get the capability of modulating more controls using the Combinator programmer. Next, I continued on with Reason sampler devices and tested the new Dr. Octorex. So I've just loaded one loop into Dr. Octorex, and I've set up the polyphony for each device as 10. And that will mean that an entire combinator with 14 Dr. Octorexes will add up to 140 polyphony. I've turned the filter on, and I've also disabled loop playback because we want to play back 10 slices at once. And if we enable loop playback, that kind of messes up the works by playing the entire loop instead of single slices like we want. So for Dr. Octorex, it came out as 2,660 voices. I find that a really encouraging number. I didn't have a chance to try the original Dr. Rex since I no longer have that installed on my system. But with such a high number of voices, that's very close to NN19, but it seems like the speed of the original Dr. Rex has been mostly retained in Dr. Octorex, and just features have been added on. So that's really great to see one of these older devices get updated, but still keep its really excellent performance. The next test is for Redrum, and Redrum actually broke the Subtractor record for voices on my system, and it has the highest number of voices that I was able to test for, and that's an even 3,500 voices, which is completely incredible. I've loaded the factory R&B kit with high quality interpolation. And since we've got only 10 samples in Redrum, I've adjusted the sequencer track. So instead of 32 notes being triggered, there's 10 notes being triggered starting on C1. So with 14 devices per combinator, once again multiplied by 10 notes, each combinator has a total of 140 notes. So as far as the samplers in Reason go, Redrum is by far the most efficient. And if you can use it for whatever sampling you need done, say just triggering some samples here and there, especially for drums that obviously don't need any type of pitching, but for drums, effect samples, or whatever, I think Redrum still sounds great, and it's virtually free for any newer computers. You could run just about as many as you'd like, and other than the memory cost, the CPU cost will be almost unnoticeable. Finally, I really wanted to test out Kong, seeing as it's a brand new feature in Reason 5, and seeing as how it seems to be a trend from the Subtractor going to Thor, that many less voices were possible. I wanted to see how much a performance hit you take by using Kong in your productions. And so I did that in a few different ways. And the first test I did was the physically modeled snare drum. I loaded that on 16 pads. And then I created a sequencer track that triggers each one of those pads. And then, of course, there are 14 Kongs in a combinator. So that's 16 times 14 as far as voices, which comes up with 224 voices per combinator. So for the first time in this test, I wasn't able to actually run this complete combinator. I couldn't manage 224 voices, and what I ended up with was actually considerably less than that. I was able to run 128 voices of the Kong physically modeled snare. And out of actually all the tests I did, it was the most CPU hungry of any of Reason's instruments. I will say that the results were a little bit strange because the CPU limit hit on 128 voices, but strangely, as I was looking at my Windows performance monitor, the performance spikes on the CPU didn't actually appear to be going all the way up to 100. So I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but I'm just a little bit surprised at this low number. And I hope it wasn't due to perhaps a system glitch. So I'd be curious to know what numbers you came up with for the physically modeled snare. I followed up that first Kong test by continuing on and testing the synthetic snare drum, which is something more akin to, an 808 snare or something in that vein. So it's loaded the same way, 16 different pads. I assumed that it would be much better performing than the physically modeled snare, and maybe even somewhere near the Subtractor, considering it's got very few parameters, and it's essentially just a very small virtual analog synth. So what I found as I tested it is that it definitely performed better than the physically modeled snare, but it's nowhere near Subtractor, and it's actually very close to Thor's performance. I got 336 voices out of the Kong synthetic snare drum. So the next test I was pretty curious about because the NN Nano sampler in Kong is pretty similar in looks to the NNXT, and it's fairly similar in function to Redrum because, of course, you have a very simple sampler in Redrum for loading drum sounds, and that's primarily what most people are going to use Kong for with the NN Nano loaded. So I loaded in this snare drum from the factory library and tested how many voices I'd get with the NN Nano. and I got 400 voices exactly. So in comparison to the redrum, I had 3,500 there. And in comparison to the NNXT, I had just over 2,000 there. So it's considerably more CPU hungry than either of those options by far. So I'm wondering if perhaps if you have some simple sample triggering duties for Kong, that you might not be better off using Kong just to trigger different devices. By using the gate outs, you can trigger any device. So using it to trigger a redrum or NNXT would save quite a bit of CPU in most scenarios. If you don't absolutely need your sounds in Kong triggered by an NN Nano, then you probably are better off just using the Kong to trigger an NNXT or a redrum module. Now, to finish up with the Kong drum modules and actually finish up with all the Reason tests, I tested the polyphony of the Kong Nurse Rex drum module. And I figured that this was going to be somewhat close to the Dr. Octorex number, seeing as they have fairly similar capabilities, although in some ways Dr. Octorex can go far beyond what Nurse Rex can do. But Dr. Octorex doesn't have all the interesting trigger modes that Nurse Rex has, which enables you to do some cool stuff, like even our own Nucleus Sound Lab multi-loop technology that we used in nano sequences. That wouldn't be possible on Dr. Octorex. So with all that said, how did the Kong Nurse Rex do? Well, I achieved 736 voices of polyphony out of the Nurse Rex. And once again, that's in comparison to 2,660 voices for the Dr. Octorex device. This one is probably the most puzzling of the performance differences that I found here this month. Whereas with even, say, the NN Nano compared to the NNXT, well, the NNXT was created many years ago, and the NN Nano is brand new. So it's somewhat expected that you're going to get a large performance difference in that case. But here, with the Octorex and the Nurse Rex, these both came out in Reason 5, and as I said before, they have fairly similar capabilities, even though one is better than the other at certain tasks. So to see something like 2,600 plus voices against 700 voices is something I really can't explain. So I will say it again, if you need to just trigger loops in a simple way without some of the unique features that the Nurse Rex offers, you may be better off using Dr. Octorex on its own outside of Kong, or you may be better off using Dr. Octorex triggered by one of Kong's drum pad gate outputs. We should probably put these numbers in perspective. So with a relatively modern computer like I've got, the lowest amount of voices from any device was 128. In any average song, I would like to think that probably 128 voices is enough to get most things done. But of course, we use our CPU for other things. We haven't gotten into any effects, and we haven't used any modulations or CV signals at all. So I can't say exactly how that would factor into how many voices you'd get in an average song. What these numbers are useful for are purely comparing the devices against each other. So we do know that Subtractor is 8 times more efficient than Thor. So if you have a production that may be close to peaking out your CPU, you may want to look at replacing some of those Thor voices that you're using with Subtractor voices. and especially for simpler electro sounds or effects, Subtractor still works fine. But right now, what I'd like to highlight is some of the unique functions that Subtractor excels at that Thor can't necessarily duplicate. I've touched on this in the past, but this is going to be a little bit more in depth than before. So I've pulled up an initialized Subtractor patch here so we can focus in on what's important. And what's important when it comes to the uniqueness of Subtractor are the oscillators. And the first aspect that's important are the 32 different waveforms in Subtractor. So there's some fairly different stuff in there from, say, the wave tables in Thor or the grain tables in Maelstrom. Sometimes I've been asked what waveforms are best for what sounds, and it's really hard to say. There's a good primer for this in the Reason manual that goes through each waveform and gives some suggested uses and whatnot, but it's really only a rough guide. For instance, they say waveform 17 is great for string sounds, but I've never really found that in my experience. They say that waveform 7 is great for electric piano sounds, and it probably is, but I've tended to use it for more bell-like sounds with a patch I'm going to show you in just a few minutes here. So it's best to just experiment as far as the waveforms. I have noticed that some of the waveforms don't sound that great to the extreme ends of the keyboard, and I believe that's due to aliasing, and it's no big surprise that virtual analog synthesizer this old, dating back to Reason 1, is going to have some aliasing issues. It does on some certain waveforms, but with others, I don't find it to be much of a problem at all, especially if you play in between, say, C1 and C5. So moving on from that, we've got the really unique phase controls that the Subtractor offers. We've got 3 different modes, and the circle means off, where phase does nothing. The X means multiply, where the Subtractor is going to take a second identical waveform that's slightly out of phase, depending on where the phase knob is, and it's going to multiply that with the original waveform. And the third mode with the subtraction is going to subtract that identical out of phase waveform from the original waveform. It produces some sounds similar to pulse width modulation depending on which waveform you're using it with. And you can see that when the phase difference is at 0, you actually won't get any sound at all because there's no phase difference and the 2 waveforms are canceling each other out. The final unique aspect of Subtractor is the FM modulation. Obviously, you can do FM mod in Thor, and it sounds great, but I feel it has a bit of a different character in Subtractor. Obviously, this is a synthesizer that was programmed quite a while ago, so they don't sound exactly the same. Not only that, but it's interesting to FM modulate something while at the same time maybe phase modulating the modulator or phase modulating the carrier in the FM. So by combining the phase controls, the FM control, and some of the unique waveforms in Subtractor, I've got some sounds that aren't very close to the usual VA stuff and aren't very close to what I've got coming out of Thor on a regular basis either. And of course, the final plus is that these sounds are created virtually for free. I can have a virtually unlimited polyphony with them. I can create tons of different Subtractor devices. I can use multiple subtractors to create unison to fatten up the sound. I can do all these things with multiple devices and pretty much never worry about running out of CPU. Now I'm going to play you a few patches that I created recently using Subtractor just to show off some of those unique features that I mentioned in the last segment. So here I've got multiply bell, and it's just purely a subtractor with a course after it. And let's listen to it. So this is using that 7th waveform that I mentioned that Propeller Heads mentions is good for electric piano-like stuff. Like I said, that may be true, but this is more of a bell tone. So the mod wheel controls the LFO depth, and the LFO depth is controlling FM. So if I turn the mod wheel down, you just have that little bit of FM grit that's fading in and out. And if I turn the mod wheel up, we just get a pure sound without FM. And also, this is a multiplied waveform using phase. So we can listen to some different phase combinations that we could use alternatively. So you can get a very thin sound at these low phase subtraction settings, and then you could perhaps raise volume to compensate for that. And you can change the FM amount. I've got it at such a low amount right now, just of 2. So you could very easily change that and come up with some different sounds. I find that a little too extreme for the sound that I was going for. So just in that 7th waveform, modifying that and choosing from different modulators with FM and then changing the different phase modes, you can get a lot of interesting bell-like sounds. Personally, I really like that patch, even compared to some synth bells that I've come up with using Thor that are frankly much more complex and took longer to create. So there's a hybrid bell tone courtesy of Subtractor. All right, so I've got another patch here to show you, showing off Subtractor. and it's called Sub Guitar. So this patch uses the 9th waveform, and according to the manual, this waveform is good for electric bass sounds. And obviously it's not being used like that here. I think it's really interesting for plucked, any kind of plucked guitar or ethnic instrument type sound. So I don't have too much really complicated going on here. You can see I've got a little bit of detuning, and I've got some FM, and that FM is just courtesy regular sine wave that's not tuned to anything crazy. I don't have really anything going on in the way of phase. I do have mod wheel raising the FM amount, and let's hear what that sounds like. So in the lower register down here, it's kind of got more of a characteristic FM sound, whereas up top, it's got a nicely more brittle, plucked sound. I've also got some simple low-pass filtering here that you can easily figure out by looking at it. So I think it's a great plucked sound. Of course, when it comes directly out of Subtractor, you're always dealing with a monophonic signal, and that can be okay for some sounds, but in this case, I wanted a stereo sound. So as I alluded to before with Subtractor, since you have such high CPU efficiency, it's no big deal to just add, say, 4 subtractors as I did, playing the exact same patch, pan them, and slightly detune them against each other, and you get basically a unison sound that's virtually free once again. The major drawback of this approach is obviously that it's harder to tweak sounds after you've created it. What I like to do is mostly finish a patch and then duplicate the patch and detune it. Because if you're still working on a patch and you duplicate it, then of course, say I wanted to change waveforms, well, I have to do that on all of the subtractors, which can be somewhat of a hassle. So if you want to tweak a patch after the fact, often you're going to have to turn to the combinator controls and map a single rotary to a common function that you'd like to map to every one of the devices. Even then, it's time consuming because you have to add a combinator programmer row on each one of the subtractors. So oftentimes I prefer to just simplify it and use the unison reason device, even though it doesn't sound quite as good. And in the next patch, that's exactly what I'm going to do. This last patch that I'm going to show you based on Subtractor is called Number String. It's got a little bit more in the way of effects and routing than the other patches do. But of course, that's a good example because when you save a bunch of CPU by using a core sound from Subtractor, you can afford to add some expensive or more expensive effects to dress up the sound a little bit. So it's got an arpeggiator, so I will now just play a little bit and you can hear how it sounds. So once again, it's basically like a plucked sound. And I actually started out with the 15th waveform, experimenting with it. The propeller heads say that this one is good for, I believe, string or cello, violin type sounds. I tried a little bit of a synthetic orchestra type sound, but it veered a little bit too much on the synthetic side. So I trimmed it back a little bit and came up with another interesting kind of plucked arpeggiated sound. And if you play with the amp envelope release parameters a bit, you can get another sound that I quite like. So we can examine what's going on here now. Once again, it's just basically interplay between a good sounding waveform, some phase difference, some frequency modulation, and some filtering. So we've got some FM here coming from a sine wave that's pitched up 2 octaves. So you could play with the pitching. It's also pitched up 7 semitones as well. You could play with the pitch and come up with some different sounds. It's interesting that there's kind of a sweet spot on the FM rotary before the sound becomes kind of over-modulated and noisy. It becomes kind of brittle. I would say anything between 50 and about 75 is that brittle area, and I really like modulations in that area. We've got the phase difference here as well. I kind of like, actually, with these changes, how it sounds in the lower register now. It's somewhat more solid using the multiplication instead of subtraction, and a little bit of a changed FM amount. Something that I haven't touched upon yet is the mod envelope, and how the mod envelope can be useful for modulating some of these parameters like phase and FM. So why don't we just try a little bit of envelope to modulate the FM amount right now. In this case, I actually prefer the constant amount of FM. I think we had it around mid 30s there. So that concludes our kind of mini look back at Subtractor that ties in with a performance review of Reason. Overall, I'm happy that I did this performance review just so it kind of crystallized in performance terms how much more efficient some of these older Reason devices are. For myself, I'm going to put into practice some of the performance lessons that I learned when creating combinators and creating patches for future products for the most part. Of course, for many of you, it will be in your everyday productions. And I'm not sure how often the average person is running out of CPU in Reason nowadays, but certainly if you are, or if you're on a little bit older computer, having this information at your fingertips is very, very useful. So I hope you enjoyed this issue. And if you have more questions about Subtractor, or there's something else that you're interested in maybe looking at with the sub in a future issue, let me know and I'd be happy to have a look at that. As always, your feedback is appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back next month. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.